Hello and welcome, and I am astounded by the class of '66. A, you can read. B, you're on time. Phenomenal. Just a very, very brief introduction, and I wanted to personally thank Andy Stott for putting this together. He did all of the work. I just want to say that the people who took responsibility for the various programs that we have did an astounding amount of work and thought we're going to do it. So thank you, Andy.
So this is the what we call the experiences workshop. When we were at Andover in '66, there were a few of us, but only a few, I think, who had any idea the experiences that they would have and the things they would do before their 60th reunion. And we had no idea what anybody else would do. As it turns out, you guys and our class has been, I think, in my mind, extraordinarily successful in so many areas: business and law and medicine and music and education, in just a wide number of areas. And so what we thought we'd do was put together an experiences workshop, and the folks who you all know are going to talk are exemplars, I think, of the great things that the people in our class have done. And we hope for this sort of workshop just to get the ball rolling a little bit and encourage everybody to be a little inquisitive with each other. You know, what's your proudest moment? What have you done? And find out about all the things that people have done over the years, because they're, from everything I've learned, they're extraordinary. So what we're going to do is we're going to have each of our speakers speak for about 7 minutes and give you a background of the kinds of things that they've done. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And if you have questions, that's great. If you don't have questions, I have a few. In the interest of full disclosure, I have actually tipped these guys off with the questions I might ask. But at any rate, so we're going to start with Rich Delaney, and I'm going to take everybody alphabetically, so there's no favoritism.
Andy,
Yeah.
quick request, would you all speak up?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What are you saying?
What? Just turn up your hearing aid. I already know.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thanks for being here. Any one of you, the other group of 5 could be here, because you've all had wonderful experiences, I'm sure. And I'm honored to share what I've done over the last 16 years now. Mostly with focus on oceans and coasts, and the protection, management, and conservation of those resources. And I've approached it from a number of different angles, but my initial motivation was on Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. I was a senior at Harvard. Karen had a great job at Harvard Trust, and she was working, and I was goofing off in Harvard Square. And classes had been canceled because of the war. And they were replaced with teach-ins. You remember teach-ins?
Yes.
I walked down through the square and I saw this little sign saying, "Teach-in about Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of landscape architecture."
Yes.
I said, "What is this all about?" I went down and listened to the lecture, and that changed the whole trajectory of my life.
Wow.
And by the way, Frederick Law Olmsted designed this part of our campus. He went to Andover in 1859, 1 year, until he got poison sumac poisoning in his eye. Couldn't see, had to leave, and yet designed all those parts with that handicap the rest of his life. But he designed the West Campus, Westport. So anyway, too much about Frederick Law Olmsted. But that's what put me on this track of. In the very first attempt was Karen and I looked at the oceans and coasts as educators. And we started an outdoor education program inside Cape Cod National Seashore for 5th grade classes in a former Coast Guard station out in Truro, one of the most beautiful parts of the Cape. We lived in this big, beautiful building. You could look over the ocean. Unfortunately, every one Monday morning, a school bus full of 5th graders would come up and join us. They would leave on Friday, and then often a bunch of older party people would join us for the weekend. But it was a wonderful time, and it was our first attempt at through education. Next, approach that I took for working with oceans and coasts was as a regional planner. And I joined the Cape Cod Commission and helped design a regional plan vision for all 15 Cape Cod towns. If you know Cape Cod, each town is pretty independent and does its own thing, but we managed to knit that all together with a regional plan. Later, I was asked to go up to Boston and work for Governor Dukakis and run a program called Coastal Zone Management, which isn't often well known, but it's a really powerful program. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But it's the reason why I got very much involved in the cleanup of Boston Harbor, which Andy said, what's my most significant and satisfying experience? It probably was being really instrumental in the cleanup of that harbor. But after that, I went over to UMass Boston.
Thank you.
Glad to start. You're welcome. So I took that experience the cleanup to University of Massachusetts Boston and was the founding director of a research institute that wanted to pursue harbor cleanups. And that enabled me over the next 10 or 12 years to travel to as many as 24 countries to share the experience of Boston Harbor with mostly developing countries, urban harbors. So that just brought me the experience, and I won't go through all the wonderful places, maybe it's a Q&A, but that was wonderful. And then we retreated, Karen and I retreated back to the Cape, and I became the director of a nonprofit organization that I just recently retired from called the Center for Coastal Studies. And the Center for Coastal Studies is a group that's best known for people who disentangle whales out in the open ocean. 50-foot long, 50-ton whales that are thrashing around, tied up in fishing gear. And not me, but my colleagues would go out in little Zodiacs, get beside these whales, and with the, not the harpoon, but a harpoon with the tip turned around, cut the rope off the whale. Amazing, courageous, dangerous stuff. But our organization has done that now and saved over 200 whales. And when you have an endangered species of right whales, and there are only 380 of them right now, that's a big survival impact. So that's the lesson. Then from there, most recently, what I've been doing is working with a group called the Global Ocean Forum. And the Global Ocean Forum is just a nonprofit, bunch of volunteers who are attempting to put oceans on the international agenda. So you think about all the Earth summits and the climate change conferences that have happened in recent years. For the longest time, the organizers and the people who wrote those platforms didn't include oceans. Everything was about the atmosphere, about the terrestrial impacts of the deserts and temperature change. Fine, but oceans are an integral part of climate change and impact them most directly. So we've been successful. The Climate Paris Accord was the first time we actually got the word ocean in the text. And I worked with John Kerry closely in that, and we managed to do it. So the international work has kept me pretty busy in recent years. But back the last couple minutes I have, Andy, Boston Harbor was notoriously known as the dirtiest harbor in the country. A lot of them were dirty back then in the 1980s. But in 1988, one of our fellow classmates, George H.W. Bush, came into the father, H.W. Bush, came into Boston Harbor. My coach.
I've got one too.
And proclaimed Boston Harbor to be the dirtiest harbor in the country. Of course, he was running against Mike Dukakis, who I worked for. And that really slowed down the Dukakis campaign, unfortunately. Probably eliminated my small chance of going to Washington ever and working in the White House. But Duke lost. The Duke lost, but the harbor still remained a central point. So over the next 10 years, I was the staff. I and my staff were the drivers of a strategic plan to clean up Boston Harbor. And it took a lot of political, economic, social, strategic maneuvering to get all the money and the politics and the towns to line up. The harbor, by the way, is
was, at that time, the source of the pollution from 42 towns in metropolitan Boston. So that's not the city, but 42 towns in metropolitan Boston all had their sewage coming to two pipes and dumped almost untreated, often untreated, raw sewage into the harbor. And when Bush was out there, it was all this gaggle of press pointing out, he did in fact see oil slicks and all kinds of nasty stuff floating around. So that was the instigation. Now, years later, it's swimmable, fishable, it's priceless, and it's actually more than priceless. We just read a study. The cleanup cost $4 billion that we had to raise back when I was working with it. It seemed like a huge number. A recent economic evaluation study just last week said it's now worth $180 billion.
Wow.
Just
Good
like-
investment.
So that's a really good investment. But it took a long time to get there. I would say the big thing that we did is we created a brand new agency. We had to get rid of an agency full of political cronies that were doing nothing and were the reason why the harbor was polluted. They just didn't invest any money in it. They didn't have any money. We managed to eliminate a state agency, which is pretty hard in this state. Create a brand new independent authority, gave them the ability to raise its own money. It's called the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. They quadrupled the citizens' water rates. And the citizens, to their credit, paid it. They understood. We did a lot of public education, but they paid it, and they raised lots of money, and that was one of the big keys. So the two quick, big exciting parts of that solution, we had to figure out what to do with the sludge. This is not great dinner talk. Fortunately, it's afternoon. But that cleanup process creates thousands of tons of sludge after the processing. And we've managed to convince the orange growers in Florida that they needed a good organic fertilizer. So we put it on train cars and shipped it to Florida.
That's great.
So next time you drink your big glass of orange juice,
They're still taking a lot of shit down there.
The last quick thing, we had to also dig a 9-mile tunnel underneath Boston Harbor through bedrock that could be big enough to drive a truck through. And the effluent that's still partially sewage, but it's clean, goes 9 miles through bedrock out into Massachusetts Bay before it's diffused up into the water. Think about drilling a 9-mile tunnel through bedrock that you can drive a truck through. That's the scale of what we have to do. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. You can see I'm so excited about it. Sorry, we're over time here. I'll take questions later.
Yeah, we'll do
Did
questions
you
later.
recruit the Swiss to do the tunnel?
No, we should have.
So some of us faked one way and went the other way, and Jim is one of those. So tell us about.
Which way did I go?
Well, I'm not sure. But, tell us, Jim. Tell us about
Jim, you
your
were
farm.
on these.
Yeah, good people. And just make sure you get all the right answers out in the margin.
We can share.
It'll be tested at the end of this presentation.
Well, that's just passing around a little bit of information that I think puts a little perspective on where Summit, Washington was in 1966 and where it is today. And just to give you one thing, in 1966, there were 321 registered lobbyists in Washington. And this year, there are 16,200 registered lobbyists in Washington, of which I, for many years, have been one. Not happening this year, but that happened. So that's why I passed that out. We'll not necessarily talk about it, but just so you have some background information. When I left college, I went to Deerfield, and I taught American history at Deerfield. I was there for 9 years. Loved every minute of it. My last 3.5 years, I was dean of students. A great time. I was only 24 years old, and the oldest students were 18. So the gap between us was not all that far. And early on, I don't know how many of you remember the name David Pinchon, but he was English teacher of the year in Will Hall, right? Well, he's the person that hired me. He was the headmaster at Deerfield, and that's how I ended up out there. And as they say, it was all male, which was definitely a limitation, but it also, for me, gave me a chance to connect closely with students. I had to deal with David Pinchon, and I would call him Mr. for the first 6 or 8 months, but I had to deal with him that if I was going to be dean, that unless a student had had a significant drug factor, sold drugs on the campus primarily, I did not have to send a student home. That I could send a student home for 48 to 72 hours, and that's what I did. And their parents had to bring them back. So instead of expelling them and putting that red star on the forehead, I decided there would be a better way to deal with youth. So that was my modus operandi back then. And it got to a point where today's King of Jordan, Abdullah, and his brother were there, and both of them had some problems along the way. Their father would come visit once a year, so I had a chance to talk to him about his boys, who were great. Last experience when, as Dean of Students before I moved on, was that, and as Dean of Students, I wasn't quite Grenville Benedict. That wasn't how it was working, thank God. But I did have a walkie-talkie beside my bed, and on weekends strapped to my waist 24/7. And one night, in the middle of the night, I get a phone call from security. And security says, there's a person on the phone for you. He identified himself as a policeman in Montreal, and he wants to talk to the dean. And so I get up, I'm sitting on the side of my bed, and I'm talking to this Canadian Mountie, I don't know if he's on a horse or not, talking to him, and he says, I think I have 2 of your boys here. And I said, okay, well, let me talk to one of them. And so somebody, I don't remember who it was, somebody gets on the phone and he says, yeah, you know that railroad tracks that goes behind the campus? So-and-so, and I thought we could jump a train and go to Greenfield, which is like 4 miles away, right? But what happened was it picked up speed as it got out of Deerfield, and it didn't slow down again until it got to Montreal.
Wrong train.
So who gets to call the mother and father, right? And so the next morning, and it was early, 7 or whatever, I called the first boy's mother, and after telling her that, don't worry, your son is fine. However, there has been a matter of his behavior, and her reaction was, what? Just like that, what? And I told her that her son, I really handled this poorly, but if you think of me as mid-20s, I said, well, he and so-and-so are in Montreal. And she said, well, what are they doing in Montreal? And I said, well, they're at a police station up there right now. And then she said, how did they get to Montreal? And I said, by accident, I said, they took a train. And I can hear 2 things on the other end of the phone. I can hear the mother saying, you're the most irresponsible man I've ever met. And I can hear the father in the background laughing like crazy. It was one of those great things. And there's other stories like that if you're being a student somewhere. Now, there were about 500 boys at Deerfield, and there were 535 members of Congress, 435 as representatives and 100 as senators. So the fact that I've had that experience in Deerfield really set me up well for Washington. After 9 years at Deerfield, I had decided it was time to move on, and the head of development and alumni at Deerfield said, well, let me introduce you to a couple people. And so I went and interviewed with some bankers in New York and so on. But then he said, I'm gonna send you to meet this congressman in Washington. So I go and I meet Silvio Conti, who covered this western part of Massachusetts for many years. He was nominated for by both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party 13 times. And that's important because I'm much more of a Democrat, but as he was a Republican, I was working for him. So I had a certain label to me, and I had to work around that. But I end up in Washington as the staff director of an appropriations subcommittee in the House. And the subcommittee, what went through and by the way, I don't see Peter Franchot, but Rick Redmond, you're not allowed to ask a question, you're not allowed to say anything, you're not allowed to correct.
Just like being home.
You know, Rick wrote, I'll get back to this, but Rick wrote a book when he was 12 years old called The Dance of, and it was his second book, called The Dance of Legislation. And I bought more copies than anybody. I taught while I was in Washington, I taught a course at a university in Milan, Italy. And it was mostly virtual, but I would go there a couple times a year. These 21 kids would all, master's candidates, would all come to Washington. And I did that for 9 years. And I would buy as many books of Rick's as I could find and give them to these kids. Because the reason they were in this class was they wanted to figure out how laws and decisions were influenced in the U.S. And that's why they were there. So, thank you, Rick. I spent 3 years as staff director. Now, I'd been a school teacher and dean of students, and I arrived in Washington, and all of a sudden I realized I'm the staff director of a subcommittee that has $165 billion that my staff is to review annually and make recommendations to the members of Congress as to how they should vote on each item. Now, I had chosen Health and Human Services and Education, and the Department of Labor as my specific areas, developing some expertise, hopefully. And then we had, in my committee, we had defense and agriculture and everything you can imagine. So I'm there 3 or 4 weeks, and I've got books and books of fine print. And some would say $50 million at the end of the line. Others would say 2. Others would say $250 million. And I'm going through it, and I'm realizing that I'm responsible for a group of people, a little more experienced than me, thank God, who would review all the spending line by line that the government had done for 3 years before. And then we would have a discussion about how much spending we were going to recommend to the members of the Appropriations Committee that they should spend the coming year, next fiscal year. And that was my job for the first 3 years. And it was exciting and so on, but very much so. But I had a long, steep learning curve. After about a month, I went back to my office, by the way. You got to think about it. It's not about me, but you got to think about it. Handling about $165 billion a day I stepped foot in Washington. Right? My office is not an office. It's a cubicle surrounded by 3 bookcases, two floors below ground, without a window, and it was 6 feet by 8 feet. And so I'm saying to myself, oh my God, how much importance do they put on this or don't they? But, so after a few weeks, and you're going to have to hit me here, after a few weeks, I go to the congressman and I say, there's no way I and my staff can analyze all of this and make recommendations to you, 13 members of Congress, every program, and he says, fine. You got to remember how long I've been there. He says, fine, okay, look, you got a program that's $25 million or less, you decide. Anything above $25 million, you bring it to me and we'll discuss it. So all of a sudden I've gone from teaching American history and being dean of students to having the ability to throw 25 here or 25 there.
Sorry?
We should probably move along.
Let's move on.
So that's my first take.
We can pick up a lot of the questions at the end, but, you know, some people left Andover and maybe spoke English in another language. You know, Fernando leaves Andover speaking English and Spanish, not satisfied with that. He's got to learn French and Italian fluently. So, which he did in working a long career in education.
Give me a minute when I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
I tend to drag on. I just remember always wanting to build. I think I always wanted to create things, and I think I remember at age 6 or 8, I was building tree houses.
Louder.
I was selling. Can you all hear me?
No,
Oh,
stand
sorry.
up,
So I remember at age 6 or 8, always wanting to build. Didn't matter what, whether it was tree houses, or camps, or whatever. And even at a very young age, I knew I wanted to become an architect. So I was fortunate. I had a very clear career move that sort of shaped my life. And I remember at Andover when I came, I was your token Puerto Rican. There weren't many Spanish-speaking students at that time. But what really struck me about Andover is that it catered to a whole range of abilities and different backgrounds and different interests. And you made friends. And by the way, a third of our varsity baseball team is sitting up here, believe it or not. Recognize that. Anyway, I got sort of wrapped up in the arts, and I think Andover had the premier art program in secondary schools. You all had to take, you don't remember this, you all had to take some art at some point in your career here. That was transformative to me. And at Eric's commemoration, it was really clear to me that Andover had influenced his life and probably influenced many of us. You know, I believe in creating beauty. That's kind of what drove me into architecture, but also into education. And I was fortunate enough, after I graduated from, Jim was my roommate, we all went thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to get to where we want to get? What steps do we have to take to reach our careers or our goals in life? I went to Andover, Jim went to Deerfield, and I was able to teach with the premier arts team and you know, Diz Bensley and all these other incredible teachers. And I came back remembering all my teachers as misters and all of a sudden calling them by their first name, playing poker with them, believe it or not. So it was a wonderful experience, but it also gave me an opportunity to really explore architecture because one of the teachers, named John McMurray, he came up with this idea to design a playground for a public school just down the road from Andover. And the plan was that we would design in the fall playground. We would then build models and sell it to the public school. And of course, our clients were the students. You know, these were 4, 5, 6-year-olds. And it struck me that the youngest students were the most creative. They had, you know, use of color. They wanted to do really crazy things. Whereas the older they got more traditional, you know, worry about safety and, you know, seesaws and swing sets. But the younger kids were really very, very creative. So that struck me as incredibly how we work the creative urge of our students at a very young age. They lose it, and they start believing they can't draw, they can't paint, we all can paint. You know, as Picasso says, you know, everyone's an artist, every child is an artist. So from that experience, and we built this playground, and I've also really always loved building. I love building with stone, wood, whatever. And those of you who came to my mini reunion in L'Étape will know that, you know, I spent 50 years restoring this hamlet in the south of France. And it's become kind of for me, an escape, if you will. When you get involved in projects you love, it's not work, is it? It's sort of a joy that you have. And to share it with other people, even more important. So I went from, you know, my love of architecture to also love of education. And incredible that I was able to combine the two in one life. Creating schools, I built 6 schools in Europe, or founded them and helped design them and use. And you know, how many of you have been in education at some point in your lives? Incredible number. You see, we should have a symposium on education because that is what transforms kids' lives. Those are the kind of transformations that really make a difference. It's a noble profession. So I'm glad to see so many of you have been in education because it's such a, and I didn't know I was going to stay in education. I went on a 1-year leave of absence from design school to TASIS, the American school in Switzerland. And I have to blame this guy right here. Topper came to Andover when I was teaching here to recruit students for our PG program in Lugano, Switzerland. And he approached me and said, you know, Fernando, he saw what we were doing. We were doing something. And by the way, Eric's commemoration was very touching. I want to thank Brian, Robin, and everyone else who was involved. It was really incredible. I remember using the Addison Art Gallery to show students' work, and I actually had an exhibition there at one point on Les Tapis. So all these connections and walking through, as we all have this past 2-3 days, it's down such a wonderful, you know, walk of relationships too. The people we met, the teachers we had, and still friendships we've had. And that's what education does. It builds relationships, it builds communities. So to me, having been working now, and the last school I started for TASIS is believe it or not, a shopping center in Sintra, outside of Lisbon. And it's an incredible building because even the foundation, the TASIS Foundation said, Fernando, I know you think you can do incredible things and crazy things, but a shopping center for a campus, we believe in beauty. And so we stripped the building back, and we have been steadily building. It's now the largest TASIS school. But Topper, I owe that I either damn you or bless you. You've been the difference in my life.
Well, the school blesses me.
Yes. So I owe everything, I think, in my life to Andover, my experience here, the friendships I've made. They've always been the closest ones. You look around the room, and these are the people who really, I think, made our lives, you know, meaningful. So for me, Andover not only got me involved with architecture and with education, it gave me my best friends for life. So to have shared them at the place that let that be where some of you came and enjoyed, I hope we'll do another one and have some more of you come. It was a really wonderful experience. And what really struck me is the people I knew here, it was good to catch up and see and spend time with them. But people I didn't know, you know, I know their names, but you know, if you're a jock, you hang around with jocks. If you're an artist, you hang around with artists. These people who I didn't know became really incredible. We had that shared experience. There's a common DNA we all had. And so it's time's up. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So we have a lot of doctors in the class, of which Ron is one. But in talking to Ron about doing this, I had to twist his arm because he's so reticent to do things like this. But I did look at on the web, and the number of 5-star reviews that Ron had for his medical practice just absolutely astounded me. And he's gonna tell you more about that.
That's out of 10, or is it out of
Thanks a lot. I thought I would start out by telling you all a little who I am. I'm very much a product, I think, of the immigrant's experience, and I think that colors all my subsequent decisions, my success at Andover, and really my success in my career, because there was a drive there as an immigrant to this country. Now, I wasn't the immigrant, but my college-educated grandmother was a governess teaching English in Ataturk's palace in Constantinople in the 19-teens, and the Pasha called her in and said, you know, there's a lot of upheaval in the streets, and it would be wise for you to bring your newborn son, my father, 3 months old, to the palace so I can protect him. And it's a little bit like the Moses story. She knew he was going to murder my father, and that's the night that they packed, fled, went to Marseille, and then came to this country. My parents' ethnicity in the 50s and 60s was not very popular, and so their goal was to assimilate. So they did not speak Armenian at home. They did not send me to Armenian school. We went to a Protestant church instead of the Armenian church. We ate American potatoes instead of Armenian food, and on it goes, trying to assimilate. The first thing I did for assimilation was at Andover, I lost my Boston accent. So that fit in a little bit. On the other hand, we came to nowadays embrace ethnicity. And so I've more or less dropped my, even though I'm known to everyone here as Ron, because I was Ron back then, I'm now Tak. And my mother had named us all with a middle name, knowing that someday we might be successful and we could drop our last name, so no one would know our ethnic secret. So I'm Ronald Wayne, which is sort of unassuming. I have a Michael James and a Kenneth Allen, but it was trying to blend in, and I don't blame her for that. That was sort of the way it was at that time, but here we are now. I'm an oncologist, a cancer physician, more specifically a lymphologist. I take care of pretty much exclusively just the lymphoma-based diseases, and those roots began at Stanford in the 70s. I was very, back then you could do almost nothing for cancer, and I was just so impressed and saddened by the stories, the suffering that cancer patients had, and the fact that my profession really abandoned those people at that time. They didn't particularly want to take care of them. It was all just symptom management and all ultimately fatal. So, but I felt an attraction to those people wanting to at least listen to their stories and try to comfort them and try to help. I was looking for a specialty that would evolve in time. I didn't want to learn one procedure and just duplicate it time and time again over the rest of my life. And I wanted the challenge of solving problems, and trying to cure cancer was a pretty big challenge. I joined a team, Saul Rosenberg and Henry Kaplan, giants in the field of cancer treatment and lymphoma treatment, who were at Stanford at that time. And every Saturday morning we would meet and methodically on a chalkboard say, we have this problem, how are we going to solve it? And through clinical trials and the such, we joined with the NCI and Vincent DeVita and came up with the MOC regimen, which was the first combined drug regimen that cured Hodgkin's. Hodgkin's is not a common disease, it's rare. There are about 15,000 new cases per year. But it has an enormous impact in your life and society because it affects young people and their entire career, their married life, their family life. Everything is ahead of them. And if you can cure those people, you've made a substantial impact, less so when you cure people my age. So it really was important work. And it was seminal because what we learned in treating Hodgkin's, we could then apply to the more difficult cancers to treat, and that's what's happened. We now cure conservatively greater than 90% of patients with Hodgkin's. And really, the challenge now is on toxicity. We have the drugs, we have the methods, we have the ways of curing people. The sadness is that many of the tools we're using are simply too toxic. And Eric, to bring it home, was an example of that. He was cured of his Hodgkin's, but when he was treated, everything was thrown at him to get rid of it, which was the first concern, and that came back to cause him to succumb from not the disease itself, but the treatment that we rendered. And we're making huge progress in that. People are treated, when I first started treating Hodgkin's, we treated with chemotherapy for 24 months, which is hell. Now we're down to 2 months in many cases. So it's been contracted. We have new drugs, we have immunotherapy approaches, and it's much less toxic. I want to end on, Hodgkin's was thought to be, well, everything was Hodgkin's and everything else was not Hodgkin's. Now we know Hodgkin's is simply one of the 80 lymphomas, so it's not right to say Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's. Hodgkin's is simply one of the lymphomas. I take care of the other 89 as well. And we've made huge success. We're able to diagnose sooner. Now, instead of waiting for biopsying a lump or something, you can do liquid biopsies, which is extracting a blood sample and looking for DNA fragments that are shed from the tumor, and you can pick up the tumor well before it's symptomatic or visible or available on imaging. Our treatments are getting, we still use ABBD, which Eric had, but its niche is a lot more confined, and we have more targeted drugs that kill cancer cells, but they don't kill our other healthy cells, and so they're less toxic. We've learned to, or are learning to harness the immune system, because the immune system ultimately is the better way to kill cancer, our own immune system rather than extraneous pharmaceuticals. And the challenge there is it works so well, and what I'm referring to are CAR T cells, if you follow this business. The challenge isn't to make it work to kill cancer, the challenge is how to harness it so it does just what you want and not anything else in the process. And that's very exciting work. One last thing I'll mention, only because it fits into the history here.
Connections is the latest New York Times word game that's captured the
Sorry, guys.
The game is all about finding the common thread.
Back in 1980, I participated with my team in Boston with the first autologous stem cell transplant for lymphoma. It seems, at the time, it seemed heroic, it was dangerous, had never been done, it was ridiculous. Now it's ho-hum, and it's also being replaced by all these newer drugs, modalities, treatments, so it's less important than it was at the time. But my only point is it's been a fun life, fun career. It's been very exciting to be in a environment where I could participate with brilliant people who really set their minds to curing cancer. And we're not there yet entirely, but we're much, much, much further along, and oncology's in its heyday for the moment, so things are coming fast and furious, and it's unfortunately keeping me from retiring, because I don't want to give it up. It's just
Don't retire.
well, but I have to give Andover credit, obviously. So that's where this whole
Thank you, Ron, that was
thing started.
fabulous. You know, it's interesting when you have classmates who are on cutting edges as Ron is, and Jack has been to a certain extent. I think in contemporary society, we see some of the things that Jack has been doing on the cutting edge.
Well, I got through med school and trained as an endocrinologist, and we worry about what is our career path. When I look back, I realize how serendipitous things happen and the path changes. And in me, the big event was 1982, when I was a young, newly minted endocrinologist. And Tricia called the medical center out of Dartmouth and said, I was born a guy, but I want to live as a woman. And this is 1982. So this carried around the whole medical center. No one knew where the hell to send it. It ended up in endocrinology. And one of the young secretaries said, Turco's a young guy, and he seems to be pretty open-minded. So next thing I knew, I got a knock on my door in my office, and Gail, who was my faithful, long-time person that used to take patients and put them into the room, said, Jack, your next patient's ready. So I'm walking down the corridor, and she looked at me and she said, you ain't gonna believe this. So anyway, I walk in, and I met Tricia and her wife sitting there holding hands. And that was the beginning of my education about transgender individuals. I had never heard the term in medical school. I had never heard the term. I knew very little. And I was used to be, kind of going in there and, be the person to spew out all of this information to the patients. And instead, I sat there and listened to Tricia's story and started to learn about this whole thing. And then very quickly, the phone kept ringing in the secretary's office, and I realized there was a heck of a lot of people that were looking for transgender affirming medical care. And no one, virtually wasn't doing it. I'm not sure I was doing it then either. So 40 years later, I've seen hundreds of transgender patients. It's without a doubt my most rewarding thing I'm proudest of and most enjoyment with. And I've given a lot of talks, many of them with transgender friends. So let me go quickly. So basic biology. 100% of you in the audience were assigned sex at birth. Okay, assigned sex. I choose those two words because it wasn't gender. You weren't assigned a gender. You were assigned sex. And how did you get assigned sex? Whoever delivered you took a look at your genitalia and said, "Oh, you have a little girl, or you have a little boy." Okay, and that was not gender development. Gender development probably starts in utero, but it developed for several years. And what we know about it, we first of all know very little about gender development. Hopefully we'll learn a lot more, just like we did in oncology, hopefully we'll learn more. But it appears that by 18 to 24 months, kids can at least identify family and friends as male or female. As a matter of fact, I remember I got a little doll when I was a year and a half that was a very well-endowed male doll. And I named it Boy Doll. And when I think back, it was right on time. By 3 years of age, most kids can identify their gender. Okay? Now I should say 97% by most studies, their gender that they are, and this is their affirmed gender, okay, not their assigned, their affirmed gender. 97% corresponds with their assigned gender. But that leaves an incredibly important 3% of people where there isn't a match between their assigned gender and their affirmed gender. Now, so one thing I want you to learn, very importantly, is how do you tell somebody's a gender? And since he's in the front row, that's tough. There is one way to find out what somebody's gender is, and I'll give you a hint. It's only one way.
Attraction to the opposite gender?
No? Karen. Huh?
Ask.
Ask the individual. I don't know of any blood tests. The other doctor, you know any blood tests?
No.
No blood tests. Ask the individual, what is your gender? And first of all, a transgender individual would be delighted to hear from you that you're interested. So I wouldn't worry about that. Okay. Now, let's hear. Yeah. So I should say gender development does continue, and 5, 6, 7 years old, it gets a little bit more rigid. Kids, really identify how their internal feeling about it is. But then around puberty and adolescence, it can loosen up a little bit, and some kids can explore it. And some of the transgender individuals that I see haven't not because they're not smart, but they just haven't figured it out and put the two and two together. Because remember, they were being nurtured, in that gender assigned at birth. But then you begin to realize that there is a discrepancy between how they feel internally and the assigned gender at birth. Now, you might say, well, what is the underlying gender development? And you might have heard the terms nature versus nurture. And that's been a big battle over the last 40 years. Nature being its genetics, it's, X and Y chromosomes, it's testosterone, and I won't go into this unless at the end we can talk. John Money in the 1950s popularized the whole nurturing. It didn't matter what your genetics were. If you were nurtured as a boy, you would become, gender identity would be boy, or vice versa. Okay? So let's get to a few definitions. Transgender would indicate that an individual's gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. And we call them transgender because molecules that are cis molecules have hydroxy groups on the same side, and trans isomers or trans molecules on the opposite side. So a transgender individual, their biological sex, in other words, their genitalia, is different from their gender identity. And a cisgendered individual, their gender identity is the same as what they're predicted by at birth, assigned at birth. Okay. Now, there's an important term, gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is the psychological distress that an individual has to deal with when they are trans. okay? And the psychological distress comes from parents, it comes from friends, it comes from society. And I should say too, I'm gonna use the word transgender for that 2 or 3%, but technically there is a smaller percent that are either non-binary, they may not identify as either male or female, or gender diverse is another one, but I'm gonna use the word transgender, save some time. The last term is transphobia, okay, and transphobia is the feeling, usually by cis individuals, cis male, cis female, of fear, dislike, or hatred of transgender individuals. And I still remember there was a patient in his late teens who was trying to deal with his transitioning and the transphobia he was feeling. And I remember I said, "How are you doing?" And he looked at me and said, "You know, Doc, I didn't ask to be transgender, but I am transgender and I'm trying to deal with it." And then, you know, and it would say, it still brings tears to my eyes when I think about that. Transphobia is everywhere in our community. And you wonder, what are the underlying causes of it? You know, some people say ethical, moral, religious. How many Catholics in the audience? Okay, I was brought up a Catholic. There's no doubt in my mind, I've been hearing about Jesus since before kindergarten. If a transgender person walked into this room right now, the first person that would go over and put his arm around the person and welcome them and protect him would be Jesus. So I don't understand some of these religious pushbacks against transgender. Then, even more despicable than this is the weaponization for politics against the transgender population. There are, there are political groups and maybe even political individuals who I honestly don't think could care about transgender. But their pollsters have said to them, you know, you can segregate that group and you can get votes. So they're weaponizing the transgender population to gain political benefits. Personally, what I think is the biggest cause of transphobia is the general lack of basic information that the population has about transgender. And I think the more education people can get and realize that this isn't pathology, this is a kind of a spectrum of gender identity. I should have said before that it used to be called gender identity disorder, and that would imply that it was a mental health problem. That's been changed, and now we talk about gender dysphoria, which is the symptoms a person gets, but it doesn't pathologize it. It's not mental health. So here's my challenge to my classmates. Do I have a minute or two?
Yeah.
Okay, here's my challenge. First of all, assess what your feelings are about transgender. You know, are you gender affirming? Are you not sure? Or you have some transphobic? And then educate yourself. You know, read all you can read. If you can, talk to somebody from the transgender community. First of all, most patients I know, most colleagues I know that are transgender would be delighted to talk to you because they'd be excited to know you are interested. Or their family. Their family would be the same way. Let's see what else I can say there. Then reassess your feelings, you know, and see how you feel. If you are transgender affirming, I'm delighted, and keep going. If you're, you know, questionable, okay. If you still have some transphobic feelings, then I understand, but keep trying to learn, okay? What is it they're going to say? So here's what I would ask. You know, the next time, in the next week or two, if you hear a transphobic comment, and I guarantee you will, a joke or a negative statement, and you feel comfortable in a comfortable situation, you have some trans-affirming feeling, confront the person. Say, you know, I find that kind of a terrible statement that you made. You know, what are you basing it on? And start a conversation. And, you know, I think, first of all, it may trigger something in that person to educate themselves and to think about, transgender patients, gender diverse patients. But I will tell you this, that the transgender community will very much appreciate you doing that. So That's all I have to say.
That's fabulous. Your reaction to all of this may be the same as mine, that it's been far too short, and that every one of these folks, and every one of you as well, have a whole lot to share. But what I'd like to do is open up to your questions. If you have none, I can ask some, but questions for any of these folks?
Well, just coming out of what you said, Jack, I have a transgender friend who, as a male, a husband and father, went through the operation and has been a female for a very long time, but did not change gender preference. So in other words, as a male,
Totally
he considered
different thing.
himself heterosexual.
Sexual.
So that was
Sexual
going to be
orientation.
my question. What do we understand about gender preference and how that relates to the matters that you have covered?
I think what we know a lot about, as much about gender orientation as we do about gender identity, which is very little.
Okay.
But my hope is that I think if we were sitting here in our 50th reunion, we'd be talking about the gay lesbian population. And I think that's made a tremendous, I think that's much less stigmatized now. I'm hoping that we're going to do that. So, yeah.
But it's not uncommon.
It's not uncommon. No, it's not. I think they're two totally separate issues.
Okay.
Lee?
Not a question, but something just to add to what you're talking about. I lived in American Samoa for about 2.5 years in my early 20s. And in American Samoa, the term was a fa'afafine, which translates to 5 woman or half woman. And this was an integral part of their culture. An interesting twist on it was that if the Samoans had very large families, 10 children is not even blinking an eye. And if they had 9 boys and the 10th was a woman, they might change the way they treated one of the boys in the family, or they might bring a person they had extended families. They would bring a person in from another family and raise them as a woman, although they were biologically men.
From what I can tell from my reading, most cultures going back years and years and years have had transgender individuals. It's not a new phenomenon, we're just hearing about it.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of it is the weaponization of it we're hearing more and more about.
Yeah.
Well,
Jim?
that may not be historically right, since the surgery has not been around for very long.
Right.
So to say the cultures have had transgender individuals for a very long time, that's a different definition.
Well, most transgender patients don't get surgery. I can't tell you the exact number, but certainly a high percentage of them don't get surgery because they don't decide to, or they can't afford it. They might take hormones, or they may not even take hormones.
But then there's still a problem of in the politics of it, of the surgery or treatment aspect of it instead of the identification,
Right.
as being a kind of significant area for most people. I mean, ultimately,
I think it's
evolutionarily, it doesn't matter.
I mean, there are some adolescents who transition at 3 or 4 or 5, and you might say, why shouldn't they get surgery when they're 9, 10, or 11? But I can understand some people saying maybe we ought to wait for them to be a majority. We can start hormones early, but so that's a difficult question.
So on a slightly different note, Ron, you spent some time in Africa. Tell me about that.
Well, I was talking earlier mostly about science, if you will, intellectual curiosity. My bigger attraction really to medicine was the humanitarian side. I hinted at that in terms of picking oncology. And we got together a group of us, primarily from the Mass General in Boston, with big ideas. And it's a lesson in futility, and it's a failure story. So unlike what I was prouder of. We try to, we're working in Uganda at a university town in Mbarara and trying to set up a cancer center for them, trying to improve cancer care, and it was really a lesson in frustration. We weren't trying to cure illnesses that there were no cures for. We were trying to take care of people with stuff that in the States would have been a no-think issue, but there was a lot of people would come out of the jungle for treatment. You had to deal with the medicine men in the local communities because if you treated them without his permission, that was taboo and dangerously so. We treated Hodgkin's. You give them drugs, their masses would melt away. They go back in the jungle thinking they're fine. That was one treatment, and they needed another 6 or 12, but they wouldn't come back because they thought they were well. So there was this huge educational issue. When you're a patient in Uganda, you bring your family and you camp out. You don't go home. You don't go to a hotel. In the ICU, you literally camp out. You lie around on the floor under the patient's bed. Electricity would go out all the time. Generators didn't really work. There were no medical staff in the intensive care unit overnight. And it's just the families and the patients and the respirators. And in the morning, you'd make rounds, and if the electricity was out, you would just count the dead because they had no care. And it was tragic. And so we said, well, we'll fix this. We know how to do this. One of several things we did was, this is back when drones were new. The cancer drug industry in Uganda, they fly into Entebbe, and at least 50% of them never make it elsewhere. They get diverted, and the other 50% is sent down to to the various cancer hospitals, and another 25% or 50% of that is scarfed off. And the number of drugs that are left is very scant, very few. And so we thought we can bypass all these criminals and we'll put the drugs on drones and we'll just fly them to us in the field. And we thought we were very clever. And that worked a few times, but the local pharmacists or whomever found us, saw what we were doing, and they would come and they would take the drugs. So we ended up, it was a no-gain situation. And we met with the ministries of health, with the head of government, with all sorts of stuff about setting up not just Mbarara, but a cancer network in Uganda, and actually a cancer network for East Africa. And again, these were pie in the sky. When I look back, crazy and stupid, and a waste of money certainly. And there's a better way to do it, but I wasn't educated in that. And I think many of you are familiar with the Paul Farmer model of if you don't impose your standards, your medical care, your values on the local people, but sort of educate them so that they can create their solutions and take care of it, I think it would have been a much more successful group. We were very successful on the pediatric side, I'll say that, and we built them a cancer center and hospital, and that's still up and running. I had to stop going there when Ebola and then subsequently the pandemic broke out, so I've not been back. But it was very important work. And for me personally, it was an incredible growth experience. I certainly felt very valued and important, but ultimately a failure. So I'm not proud of that part, but we tried.
Well, Fernando, I understand that the farm that you're renovating is probably not the right word. Rejuvenating, I guess, maybe the right word. Is artist camping or something?
Yeah, when you get into administration, the one reason you get into education is to teach. And so being able to teach again, students, many of them, we offer architecture and painting and drawing and photography. And in fact, one of my first students, Texas was a very talented photographer. Worked for Time Life, and after he's come back and he teaches the photography course. So I work with a group of people who have kindred spirits, and we share this beautiful location. And creative kids who come from all over the world. 30 kids, that's the space we have, and 8 staff. And it's just a wonderful program because we get to teach again, and we get to be students again. So that's the key to education. Keep learning, keep young, and education forces you to do that.
So, Jim, when you were lobbying in Washington, were you lobbying on a single issue, or would you lobby for any issue for any client?
Well,
Let
me know what the check
seems
is.
complicated. No, there was one man who had an existing practice with 2 clients, Boston University and Ocean Spray. And I joined up with him. And so that's all we had to begin with. But what took place was we hit a niche on finding research dollars and facilities dollars for universities and health centers. It became a niche because in Congress, if you talked about the value of monies for research, or the values of money to have the facilities to attract the people who did the research and so on, it was a much better chance you were going to get some sort of support from the government, from a committee, from a couple congressmen who would be very supportive of it. In turn, then we did our best to take that and turn it into getting matching dollars from corporations everywhere we could. And we weren't as successful at that. But when we were successful, I remember one Indiana University, was IBM, AT&T, and Lilly all existed inside of Indiana, and we're working on this project for Indiana University. And I said, well, let's go to these corporations. Let's not just go to the feds, let's go to these corporations. And what we did was we got the senator's office. So we're lobbying the senator to call these companies and tell these companies, gee, you ought to be talking to Indiana University about X. And by the time you got it done, we started to get $10 million from the feds for this project, but $42 million from these 3 companies. And so things like that led us to, we ended up with 114 universities and 90 some odd medical centers. And from 31 countries. So we had this dynamic of just having, it was being in the right spot at an unusual time, and making it work for something. So loved all that part of it. And we got almost $1 billion for breast cancer research over 4 years. It was amazing.
So, Rich is, what is, to my mind, you're an oceanographer, I suppose. But, tell us about the Atlantic current and what's going on and what's likely to happen.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm a political scientist.
Well, I know that, but I don't know if by practice
So
you sound more like an oceanographer.
I think on science, but but one of the, of course, the biggest threat right now to basically everything in the earth is climate change. But directly, the warming of the oceans is already being, the changes are already measurable. So we know it's warming. And one example is the currents in the Gulf Stream current comes up along from the Gulf, up along the eastern coast, makes its way all the way across to the British Isles. And that's a major influence on our weather on the east coast of the United States. And the other thing you should know about the currents, the Labrador current is coming down from the cold Arctic. So the two come, the cold comes down, the warmer current comes up, they can merge and deflect the Gulf Stream into Europe. As the ocean warms the Arctic waters, it slows that current down. So the Gulf Stream is moving further north, bringing warmer temperatures north. So that's part of what's driving the climate change in this part of the world. You may have seen some of the projections if we don't slow down the rate at which the Earth is warming, by 2050,
Massachusetts will have the same climate that South Carolina has right now. So that's dramatized for me. The International Panel on Climate Change, with which I work, has done modeling, extensive modeling, hundreds of different modelers from different disciplines, and they all arrive at the same basic conclusion, that if we exceed the Earth warming more than 1.5 centigrade above the temperature that it was, the average temperature that it was at the Industrial Revolution in the 1980s, then we will have passed a tipping point where some of these things like the Gulf Stream changes will be irreversible. So, I mean, it's sometimes hard for me when I even hear myself talking about these global changes, but they're science-backed, they're real, and people just have to understand that unless we reduce our production of carbon dioxide and slow the rate at which the Earth, the atmosphere, and the oceans are warming, we're going to see some dramatic changes. We might not, but our kids might, and our certainly will, and our grandkids certainly will. And it's not that it's the end of the world. It's not because it's the end of human society, but it's a vastly different climate that they will be living in. So it gets pretty dramatic. And if I could just end on one other note, you've talked about experiences and all this discussion about being in wonderful, fabulous places. One of my first experiences in this international work was in 1989, when I was invited to Latvia, Riga, Latvia. Riga is the capital of Latvia. And a group of people were trying to figure out what to do with the newfound freedom because the USSR had just been breaking up. They wanted to deal with some new environmental regulations. So as I was meeting with these folks in a building in Riga, a protest march started in the streets. And they said, Delaney, come on, let's get in front of the march. So I ended up marching, if you remember the million-person marches that were going when the USSR was breaking up, I was right in the front of one going through Riga, saying to myself, I'm either going to be dead or a cover Time magazine. So that's what was my most intriguing international experience. So we never know. Anyway.
Well, I think, these have been great, and they represent, the great things that y'all have done and everything, the things that the people in our class have done, which are extraordinary, and hopefully they'll encourage you to, talk to each other and ask sort of penetrating questions. But these guys spent a lot of time putting these things together and trying to keep them as short as I would have liked, and it's hard with their experience. But I hope you all would thank you.